January 1944. A cold wind rolls across the flat plains of the American Midwest, brushing against the outer fences of a U.S. Army prisoner of war camp. Frost clings to the timber barracks. The sky is still pale, the first hints of sunrise pushing through a thin veil of winter clouds. German prisoners, recently captured in North Africa and Italy, step out into the morning air with the slow, careful movements of men who have lived too long on short rations and constant fatigue. They expect the same thin meals they had come to know during the later years of the war. Dark bread slices measured by weight. Ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley, a smear of margarine on fortunate days. But the smell that drifts across the yard stops them. Bacon, real bacon. Sizzling on steel griddles inside the American mess hall. Steam rises from pots of oatmeal. Fresh eggs crack against metal bowls. A line of U.S. Army cooks move with mechanical rhythm, preparing a breakfast that seems impossible to men raised on ration cards and tightening shortages. The German prisoners stare, silent, unsure if what they see is meant for them. And this moment, this stunned pause, begins a story shaped long before dawn touched the camp's fences. Reaching back to the deeper forces driving the war itself. Asterisk. The shock German prisoners felt at that breakfast table cannot be understood without returning to the world that shaped them, a world where the war had already drained their homeland long before they crossed an ocean as captives. By 1943 and 1944, the German army was fighting on collapsing fronts. Men captured in Tunisia, Sicily, and later in Normandy carried with them the weight of a nation stretched beyond its limits. Their bodies reflected the shortages of the Reich. Their expectations were shaped by years of ration cuts, dwindling agriculture, and the brutal drain of a total war economy. Food scarcity had become a quiet enemy inside Germany. By late 1942, meat rations fell sharply. Coffee had not been real coffee for years. Butter was replaced with synthetic spreads. Even bread, once the dependable foundation of the German diet, was being stretched with fillers and lower quality grains. Civilians and soldiers alike felt the tightening grip. German troops fighting in North Africa often went days with minimal rations when supply convoys were intercepted. On the Eastern Front, starvation was a constant threat, intensified by winter and the immense distances between supply depots. Captured soldiers brought these experiences with them. Hunger had become normal. The United States, by contrast, had entered the war with something Germany lacked: overwhelming agricultural capacity and a secure supply chain protected by geography. American farms produced far more food than the population required, and mechanization meant shortages were almost non-existent. When U.S. soldiers fought overseas, the quartermaster corps ensured that meals remained consistent, caloric, and plentiful. Even the simplest breakfast, bacon, eggs, bread, coffee, could be delivered across oceans and into forward positions with a reliability no Axis power could match. This difference only widened as the conflict progressed. By 1943, German POWs were arriving in the United States in significant numbers. Thousands were shipped from captured North African ports, more from Italy, and later from France. Many expected harsh treatment. Nazi propaganda had warned them that Americans were brutal, materialistic, and indifferent to prisoners. Instead, they found themselves processed under the Geneva Convention, registered by the Red Cross, and placed in camps where living standards matched, and sometimes exceeded, those of the German civilian population at home. The Geneva Convention required that POWs receive the same rations as the detaining power's own troops. For German soldiers held by the United States, this meant they ate what U.S. soldiers ate. And U.S. soldiers ate well. The scale of American logistics was unlike anything the German army had encountered. Camp commanders were issued clear ration guidelines that provided generous portions of meat, dairy, grains, vegetables, and hot meals each day. Breakfast alone supplied more calories than a typical German soldier received across an entire day in 1944, for men arriving from collapsing fronts. This abundance was disorienting. Some suspected a trick. Others believed the Americans were attempting to soften them for interrogation. But when breakfast after breakfast arrived with the same reliability, hot, plentiful, unremarkable to the Americans who served it, the POWs realized this was not a performance. It was simply how the United States functioned. These early impressions inside the camps set the stage for a deeper understanding. The war was not only being fought with weapons and soldiers, but with resources, industry, and the capacity to sustain millions across continents. The endless American breakfast table, as some POWs would later describe it, was a symbol of a far larger imbalance, one rooted in global production, industrial power, and the stability of a homeland untouched by invasion. And to understand how such abundance could exist in a world at war, the story must widen beyond the fences of the camp and into the broader system that fed it. Asterisk to understand why a simple American breakfast could astonish trained soldiers. One must step into the vast machinery of the United States home front, an engine of production unmatched by any nation in the war. By 1944, American agriculture was operating at unprecedented scale. Mechanized tractors, combines, and irrigation systems transformed fields from the Midwest to California into high-output zones capable of feeding not only the U.S. population, but allied forces around the world. Even with millions of men overseas, farm production rose. Women, teenagers, and migrant labor filled shortages, while technology compensated for muscle. American farms produced more pork, eggs, milk, and grain than rationing could meaningfully restrict. Canning factories operated around the clock, turning fresh produce into durable supplies for military kitchens. Refrigerated rail cars transported meat across thousands of miles without spoiling. Cold storage warehouses held reserves capable of supporting entire armies for months. For the U.S. Army, delivering bacon and eggs to a POW camp was not an extravagance. It was routine logistics. In stark contrast, Germany's food system was fraying long before Normandy or Stalingrad. The 4-year plan, and later the total war economy, redirected vast resources to armaments, leaving agriculture short of labor, fuel, and machinery. Prison labor and forced requisitioning filled gaps but could not prevent decline. Allied bombing disrupted rail networks. Fertilizer shortages reduced yields. Rural communities that once supplied abundant food found themselves rationed and monitored. Soldiers returning from leave often expressed shock at the thinness of meals at home. Thus, a German private arriving in an American camp had lived through years of shrinking rations and interrupted supply lines. He had seen substitute foods become the norm: ersatz coffee, ersatz jam, ersatz fats. Even bread incorporated fillers like potato flour and barley. The idea of a hot, protein-rich breakfast served daily was no longer part of German wartime life. Inside the Wehrmacht, morning meals had grown minimal: thin soup, bread ration, or black market supplements when luck allowed. The U.S. Army ration manuals of 1943 to 1945, however, described a different reality. Standard breakfast items included meat, typically bacon or ham, eggs fresh when possible, powdered when necessary, cereal or oatmeal, often fortified, bread, baked daily in mobile or fixed bakeries, butter or margarine, issued generously. Coffee, always prioritized. To American soldiers, this was unremarkable. To German POWs, it resembled peacetime abundance. Their astonishment grew each morning as they realized that this was not a gesture of kindness or an exception. It was simply the output of a nation whose industrial and agricultural capacities had reached full war mobilization without ever suffering invasion, starvation, or strategic strangulation. American prosperity had survived the transition to total war intact. What POWs interpreted as a feast was, in truth, the visible surface of a system powered by assembly lines, refrigerated transport, statistical planning, and a secure continental base. For many Germans, this was their first encounter with the real scale of American strength, a strength built not only on weapons and factories, but on the ability to feed millions with consistency and quality. Word spread quickly within the camps. New arrivals listened with disbelief as veterans described the meals. Some suspected exaggeration until they stood in line themselves, trays in hand, watching cooks pile food in portions larger than what frontline units had received months before their capture. Prisoners wrote home about it, cautiously phrased to avoid censorship, but unmistakable in tone. Red Cross inspectors noted the adequacy of rations again and again, confirming what POWs already knew. The United States was operating on a level of material stability that Germany could no longer imagine, and as this realization settled, it opened the door to deeper emotional, military, and psychological angles, perspectives that reveal how something as ordinary as breakfast could reshape a captured soldier's understanding of the war. For the German prisoners standing in those mess hall lines, the shock was not merely physical, it was deeply human. Many had fought through the harshest environments of the war, the frozen steppes near Kharkov, the dust-filled ridges of Tunisia, the rubble of Monte Cassino. Hunger had followed them like a shadow. Even elite formations were no longer spared from shortages. By 1944, soldiers often received rations inconsistent in quality, timing, or caloric value, depending on the front's turmoil. So when captured men saw American breakfast portions, the reaction blended disbelief with an uncomfortable sense of vulnerability. Diaries and post-war testimonies reveal a recurring theme: embarrassment. They were professional soldiers from a nation that once prided itself on efficiency and discipline. Yet here they stood, visibly stunned by a simple meal prepared by the enemy. Some felt gratitude. Others felt humiliation. For many, it triggered an unspoken realization: the enemy did not appear starved, pressured, or strained. He was well-fed, calm, and materially confident. The human moment was powerful. Trays filled with food became a symbol of how differently the war pressed on each side. And for captured men waking each morning to the same abundance, the emotional weight only deepened, settling into a quiet recognition that Germany's hardships were not temporary setbacks but signs of structural collapse. This human dimension formed the foundation upon which all other angles of the story would build. Food in wartime is never just food. It is logistics, industrial output, and national endurance stacked onto a single plate. For the United States, breakfast represented the functioning of a system that stretched from Midwestern farms to global supply lines. Every strip of bacon, every loaf of bread, every crate of eggs depended on rail networks, refrigerated storage, assembly line agriculture, and military planning that emphasized reliability over improvisation. This food superiority directly impacted battlefield outcomes. A well-fed army moves faster, heals quicker, and maintains morale. American combat divisions consumed high-calorie meals that sustained long operations, while supply depots ensured consistency even under combat pressures. Germany, meanwhile, struggled to maintain shipments across bombed railroads and fuel-starved convoys. To German POWs, the effortless flow of American food into the camps demonstrated something far more intimidating than tanks or aircraft. It showed an enemy whose industrial foundations were unshakable. Even prisoners, men who no longer posed a threat, received more food than some German frontline units. This asymmetry wasn't accidental. It was the result of a national strategy that treated supply chains as decisive instruments of war. Where Germany improvised, the United States standardized. Where German leaders dreamed of blitzkrieg victories, American planners built systems meant to sustain prolonged global conflict. Thus, the breakfast table became a quiet but powerful demonstration of American military strength, a reminder that wars are often won by the armies that can eat, march, and endure the longest. American military culture was different from Germany's long before the first shots of the war were fired. The U.S. Army embraced a more informal, egalitarian style rooted in citizen soldier traditions. Meals were part of morale building, unit bonding, and maintaining comfort in unfamiliar conditions. Coffee, especially, became a patriotic ritual, a symbol of home and stability, carried from campfires in the Civil War to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. Germany, in contrast, emphasized austerity and discipline. Even in peacetime, the Army's culture normalized frugality, strict rationing, and modest meals. As the war escalated, this discipline hardened into necessity. Soldiers were expected to endure shortages without complaint, a mindset reinforced by propaganda portraying sacrifice as national duty. Thus, when German prisoners witnessed the relaxed atmosphere of American breakfasts, soldiers joking, cooks serving generously, officers eating similar meals, the cultural divide became unmistakable. It contradicted the propaganda image of the decadent, undisciplined American. What they saw instead was a confident army grounded in abundance, not excess. In practicality, not indulgence. This cultural revelation often proved more shocking than the food itself. It challenged assumptions about the enemy's character and hinted at a deeper theme. The United States fought differently because it lived differently. The breakfast table became a quiet window into the spirit of a nation at war, one that valued comfort, stability, and the well-being of its soldiers in ways the German system no longer could. And from these cultural and human contrasts, further layers of meaning continued to emerge. Behind every American mess hall stood an industrial organism of staggering complexity. Refrigeration units hummed quietly in supply depots. Diesel-powered trucks carried insulated cargo across thousands of miles. Rail networks stitched together the nation's agricultural regions, delivering pork from Iowa, wheat from Kansas, and dairy from Wisconsin to military bases with clockwork precision. The technological chain that made bacon and eggs appear each morning was not accidental. It was the result of decades of industrial innovation that Germany could not replicate under wartime pressure. Refrigerated transport, in particular, was a decisive advantage. German supply trains struggled with ice breakdowns and bombing disruptions, often relying on non-refrigerated freight where spoilage was common. The United States, however, operated the world's largest fleet of refrigerated railcars. Fresh meat could travel from slaughterhouses to ports without degrading, then move through military channels worldwide. Food processing technology told a similar story. The American development of powdered eggs, canned meats, and dehydrated milk allowed storage for months without significant loss of nutrition. Mass-production bakeries supplied uniform bread rations daily, even in remote camps. German POWs sensed this technological superiority without needing to see the machinery. The consistency of meals, the same quantity, same quality, day after day, revealed an industrial backbone Germany simply did not possess by 1944. What they experienced as a feast was, in truth, the byproduct of a system that had fused agriculture, industry, and technology into a single engine capable of sustaining millions. And as prisoners observed this reliability, they also began to understand the strategic decisions that shaped it. The quality of German POW meals was not merely the result of abundance. It was the product of deliberate policy. American military leadership recognized early in the war that the treatment of prisoners carried consequences for global perception, enemy morale, and international law. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to the same rations as U.S. troops, a commitment America enforced rigorously. This adherence was strategic. First, it safeguarded American soldiers captured abroad, reinforcing reciprocal expectations. Second, it aligned with the Roosevelt administration's broader vision of the United States as a moral leader, capable of waging war without abandoning humanitarian principles. Third, well-treated POWs posed fewer security risks, were more cooperative in labor assignments, and provided useful intelligence through casual conversation rather than coercion. Also understood the psychological dimension. A fed, rested, healthy prisoner was more likely to question the propaganda he had been raised on. Many German soldiers believed the United States was chaotic, greedy, or morally weak. Yet their day-to-day treatment contradicted those ideas. They were housed properly, clothed, and provided medical care. And they were fed with the discipline of a nation that followed its own rules even when no one was watching. This leadership philosophy filtered down to cooks, guards, and administrators. The breakfast table became not only a logistical demonstration, but also a policy statement. The United States would fight fiercely, but it would not abandon its standards. From such policies emerged the final, most revealing angle: how the enemy interpreted the meaning behind the abundance. German POWs did not experience their first American breakfast in silence. They talked about it, quietly at first, then openly. Reports were smuggled into letters home, disguised to pass censorship. Some wrote that the food they received was better than what their families had access to in Germany. Others described the moment of realizing that the United States, even during global war, possessed enough surplus to feed its enemies without hesitation. The implications were profound. For many prisoners, this abundance shattered core beliefs about German superiority. They had been told the United States was materialistic but weak, wealthy but undisciplined. Yet here was a nation capable of feeding millions of soldiers, allies, and prisoners simultaneously, without visible strain. Prisoners who had fought in elite units felt the dissonance most sharply. They had endured hunger in snow-covered forests or deserts. Yet the Americans provided full plates with casual ease. The boat sailors, accustomed to cramped rations on long patrols, reportedly reacted with near disbelief when they saw the volume of food served in U.S. camps. Africa. Corps veterans compared the meals to pre-war Germany, recalling breakfast from childhood rather than wartime life. Infantrymen from the Eastern Front, hardened by shortages, interpreted the abundance as the clearest sign, yet that Germany's situation was beyond recovery. These perceptions did not stay contained. Over time, they formed a shared understanding among POWs that the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The breakfast table, ordinary to Americans, extraordinary to their captives, became a symbolic moment when belief in victory began to fade. And from this shifting perception, the story moved steadily toward its decisive turning point. By the spring of 1944, the German POW camps scattered across the United States had settled into a daily rhythm. Work details left in the morning, guards rotated their shifts, and Red Cross inspectors recorded conditions with clinical precision. Yet beneath this routine, something deeper was happening. A gradual, undeniable shift in the minds of the prisoners. It did not come from interrogations or speeches. It came unexpectedly from the quiet consistency of the breakfast table at Camp Swift in Texas, one of the largest POW sites in the country. German prisoners recalled the same scene each dawn: steam rising from long metal pans, cooks ladling oatmeal into bowls, baskets of bread refilled before they ever seemed to empty. Bacon crackled on hot griddles. The smell reached the barracks before the men did. What startled them most was not the quantity on any given day, it was the repetition. This was not a generous welcome meal. It was every morning, unchanging, clockwork. Some prisoners remembered a specific moment when the realization settled in. A former Africa Corps soldier, captured in Tunisia and sent to Camp Butner in North Carolina, later described watching American soldiers scrape leftovers into waste barrels. Bread crusts, half-finished portions, Food thrown away casually. To him, it felt like witnessing the true scale of the war, not the battles, not the weapons, but the effortless surplus of a nation untouched by shortages. He had marched hungry across North Africa. He had fought on days when rations were delayed, reduced, or spoiled. And here, in a camp thousands of miles from the front, his captors discarded what his unit once rationed. Across camps in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, the pattern repeated. POWs observed the abundance not just in meals, but in the infrastructure around them. Trucks arrived loaded with supplies. Bakeries operated in dedicated buildings. Cold storage units hummed continuously. In Germany, such facilities were targets for Allied bombs. Here, they were everyday tools. The turning point grew clearer with each passing week. Breakfast was no longer just food, it was evidence. Evidence that the United States possessed a scale of resources Germany could not match. Evidence that industrial output mattered more than ideology. Evidence that the enemy, far from collapsing under its own weight as Nazi propaganda had claimed, was thriving in war. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a major agricultural region, POWs assigned to farm labor were struck by the volume of food grown for American consumption. They harvested fields overflowing with grain and vegetables, knowing most of it did not even go to the military. The country had such reserves that feeding prisoners required no sacrifice. A nation with this level of capacity, many realized, could not be defeated by exhaustion. These revelations built slowly but steadily, like water rising behind a dam. One morning, at Camp Crossville in Tennessee, a group of German non-commissioned officers reportedly stood silent in the mess hall doorway, watching the line of American soldiers receiving the same breakfast as the prisoners. Same portions, same ingredients, same rules. The Geneva Convention was not a negotiation here. It was practiced without hesitation. For NCOs raised in a system where rules were bent or broken under stress, this equality was difficult to process. It hinted at a stability that wartime Germany no longer possessed. And then came the moment many prisoners later identified as the psychological breakpoint, when they understood that the American military was not feeding them generously out of goodwill or political display. They were feeding them well because they could, because the system allowed it effortlessly, because abundance was not a show, it was an ordinary fact of American life, for soldiers who had marched through burning cities on the Eastern Front, for U-boat crews who rationed every ounce of food on long Atlantic patrols, for Africa Corps veterans who fought through supply shortages in North Africa. This realization struck with force. The enemy's strength was not inflated propaganda. It was real, tangible, tasted in every bite. The breakfast table had become a battlefield of perception. And on that field, the war was shifting. And with each passing morning, the understanding grew that this imbalance would shape not only their captivity, but the outcome of the entire conflict. For many German prisoners, the true turning point came not from a single meal, but from the slow accumulation of moments that contradicted everything they had believed about the war. It happened in quiet, almost private ways. A glance at overflowing supply rooms, a casual remark from an American guard, the sight of trucks arriving daily with food crates labeled for units far larger than any camp required. These small details merged into one overwhelming conclusion. The United States possessed a depth of resources that Germany could no longer imagine, let alone match. One former Wehrmacht infantryman held in Camp Shelby, Mississippi, later recounted how this understanding arrived with painful clarity. He watched a U.S. quartermaster sergeant conduct a routine inspection of the mess hall stores. The sergeant opened crates without urgency, flipped through inventory charts, and nodded in satisfaction at shelves lined with preserved meats, flour sacks, canned goods, and bottled milk. What shook the prisoner was not the food itself. It was the sergeant's demeanor, calm, untroubled, confident that more would come next week, and the week after, and the week after that. To a soldier from a nation tightening ration cards monthly, this confidence was a revelation. A nation that never doubted its supplies was a nation built for endurance. Boat prisoners experienced an even sharper contrast. Life aboard a submarine was defined by confinement, stale air, and dwindling rations. By late 1943, patrols often ended with crews exhausted and hungry, their boats damaged, their missions incomplete. Captured sailors, when sent to camps like Papago Park in Arizona, confronted an environment so different that some believed they were being deceived. They had expected harsh internment. Instead, they encountered orderly facilities, regulated treatment, and meals that seemed better than those they had received while serving Germany at sea. More than once, sailors expressed disbelief that the Americans would feed submariners, men who had targeted their convoys, with the same rations given to American soldiers. For elite troops of the Afrika Korps, the psychological weight was equally profound. They had once served under Rommel, whose reputation still commanded respect even in captivity. Many carried memories of campaigns marked by ingenuity and improvisation, but also hunger, water shortages, and dependence on fragile supply lines stretching across the desert. The abrupt shift from scarcity to abundance inside U.S. camps forced them to reconsider the foundations of their earlier successes. If German victories had been built on audacity and tactical brilliance, they had also been built on slim margins. The Americans, by contrast, waged war with depth in food, fuel, transports, and replacements. This recognition spread among prisoners not as rumor, but as lived experience. And slowly, conversations in the barracks began to change. The question was no longer whether Germany could win. It was how long Germany could delay defeat. At Camp Hearn in Texas, one guard recalled overhearing a group of German officers discussing this very point. Their tones were subdued, stripped of the ideological confidence that once permeated such conversations. They spoke instead of material production, the severity of Allied bombing raids on German factories, and the obvious difference between American abundance and German austerity. The food, one officer remarked, was proof of a larger truth. They can fight this war longer than we can exist. It was a heavy admission, whispered by a man who had once believed in swift, decisive victory. Among the youngest POWs boys, barely old enough for military service, the shift was even more visible. Many were encountering the United States for the first time, and their impressions shaped their understanding of the wider world. The breakfast table, the orderly camp, the sense of stability they observed daily, all of it dismantled years of propaganda that had painted America as a divided, corrupt, or decadent society. What they saw instead was a country capable of mobilizing immense strength without collapsing under the strain. By late 1944, this new perception had crystallized into certainty. Germany could still fight, but it could no longer win. The material imbalance was too large, too visible, too undeniable. The endless American breakfast table, ordinary to the cooks who prepared it, had become a symbol to the prisoners of the war's unavoidable trajectory. And from that point on, every meal served in those camps carried the same message. The conflict's outcome was already written in the quiet workings of a nation that could feed its enemies. Without breaking stride, the story now shifted beyond the moment of realization, toward the consequences that would follow for the prisoners, for Germany, and for the world awaiting the war's end. When the psychological shift took root inside the American POW camps, its effects spread with a subtle but unmistakable clarity. German prisoners, once defined by discipline, hierarchy, and ideological certainty, began adjusting to a new internal reality. They were no longer fighting for victory, but for understanding. The abundance around them, seen each morning in the mess hall and reinforced through daily routines, reshaped morale in ways that neither side initially anticipated. One of the most immediate consequences was a change in camp behavior. U.S. guards reported fewer escape attempts, fewer disciplinary problems, and fewer ideological disputes among the prisoners. Hunger was often the catalyst for desperation in wartime captivity, but hunger had vanished from these camps. With adequate food, fair treatment, and structured schedules, tensions eased. The energy once directed toward resistance or escape increasingly shifted toward work details, education programs, arts, and sports leagues established within the camps. Some German officers initially resisted such activities, fearing they diluted soldierly discipline, but younger prisoners embraced them. A sense of routine replaced the uncertainty of frontline life. Red Cross inspections consistently noted this shift. Reports described POWs who were physically healthier than expected, gaining weight after years of battlefield rationing. Medical officers recorded improvements in strength, sleep, and general appearance. This stood in stark contrast to German-held POW camps, especially those housing Soviet prisoners, where starvation was systematic and survival uncertain. German soldiers in America knew nothing would happen to them comparable to what others endured under their own nation's policies. The stability of U.S. camps even fostered pockets of remorse, though rarely spoken aloud. As prisoners realized their captors followed rules, Germany itself had abandoned in other theaters of war. Letters home carried hints of this changed mindset. Strict censorship limited explicit descriptions of camp life, but tone carried meaning. Families in Germany received messages that sounded calmer than expected, even hopeful. Prisoners reassured wives, parents, and siblings that they were being treated well, better than expected, in good health, working daily. Some letters attempted to describe meals indirectly, mentioning improved strength or sufficient rations. In German cities suffering under bombing and rationing, such words revealed more than the letter's author was permitted to say. Within the camps, work assignments deepened the prisoners' exposure to American abundance. POW labor was used across dozens of states, harvesting crops, maintaining rail yards, building infrastructure, and assisting local farmers. For many Germans, the scale of American agriculture was almost mythic. They worked in orchards so vast they could not see the end of them, in wheat fields that stretched beyond the horizon, on farms equipped with tractors and machinery far more advanced than anything found in wartime Germany. The more they saw, the more the question shifted from how strong is America to why did we believe they were weak. By early 1945, this internal transformation helped erode the last remnants of ideological rigidity among many prisoners. The Nazi leadership's claims about American decadence, social collapse, or racial weakness were incompatible with the reality the POWs lived each day. German officers struggled to maintain ideological cohesion inside the camps, but their efforts often failed. Reality was too visible, too repetitive, too undeniable. The breakfast table, the work details, the steady arrival of supplies, all of it contradicted the worldview they had brought with them. It was in this environment that many prisoners began quietly planning for a future beyond the war. Some hoped to return home and rebuild Germany with new perspectives. Others considered emigration, impressed by the stability and vastness of the United States. A few even converted their beliefs entirely, rejecting the propaganda they had once served under. Yet the immediate consequences did not stop at morale or ideology. What began in the mess halls of American POW camps would ripple outward, influencing the post-war identities of thousands and shaping how an entire generation of former soldiers viewed both defeat and reconstruction, and the full weight of those consequences continued to unfold long after the final wartime breakfast was served. As the war reached its final months and Germany collapsed under the combined weight of Allied offensives, the experiences German POWs carried from American camps began forming the first outlines of their post-war worldview. For many, the United States ceased to be an abstraction. It became a lived reality, one that offered an unexpected contrast to the propaganda they had known since childhood. And when these men eventually returned home, their testimonies played a quiet but influential role in shaping how post-war Germans understood both defeat and the world beyond Europe. When repatriation began in earnest after 1945, prisoners stepped back into a devastated homeland. Cities that had once defined German culture, Cologne, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, lay in ruins. Food shortages persisted. Infrastructure had collapsed. Families struggled to rebuild lives in environments where rationing continued for years. Into this setting returned men who had spent months, even years, eating full meals in orderly camps surrounded by agricultural abundance. The contrast was jarring. Many former POWs later admitted to feeling guilt at first. They had eaten better in American captivity than their own families had eaten in wartime Germany. Their return letters conveyed shock. The hunger at home was deeper than they had realized. Mothers and fathers had grown thinner. Children had ration stamps for bread and potatoes, not meat and dairy. The memory of American breakfasts, once a symbol of unexpected comfort, now became a reminder of how badly their country had suffered and how fully it had failed to provide. Yet these memories also carried another effect. They influenced how returning soldiers understood the emerging American role in post-war Europe. The Marshall Plan, the food aid shipments, and the massive reconstruction efforts launched by the United States felt consistent with what many POWs had witnessed in captivity, a nation with the capacity and will to feed, build, and stabilize rather than devastate. This alignment between wartime experience and post-war policy contributed to a rapid shift in attitudes. Former prisoners frequently became some of the first Germans willing to trust the intentions of the Western Allies. In interviews conducted during the 1950s and 1960s, numerous ex-POWs recalled moments when their perception of America changed permanently. One recalled harvesting wheat on a Kansas farm and realizing the United States produced more food in one state than Germany could produce in entire regions during the war. Another spoke of the fairness with which American guards treated prisoners of all ranks, something that contradicted the strict stratification of German military culture. Others remembered seeing American workers, civilians, women, immigrants, operating machines with ease, suggesting a society more flexible and dynamic than the rigid, hierarchical Germany they had left behind. Over time, these impressions filtered into the early political culture of West Germany. Veterans who had been POWs became teachers, mayors, business owners, engineers. Their stories, told at dinner tables, in classrooms, and in community halls, reframed how younger generations understood the war's legacy. They spoke not only of defeat, but of the reasons behind it, the industrial imbalance, the moral failures, the exhaustion of a nation that promised glory while delivering scarcity. Some former POWs would later credit their time in America as the moment they first questioned authoritarianism. The discipline and efficiency they had admired in Germany were present in the United States as well, but paired with freedoms and material stability that showed another model of national strength. Breakfast in the camps became, in hindsight, a metaphor, not for indulgence, but for sustainability, organization, and confidence. By the 1970s, historians interviewing ex-POWs noted a recurring sentiment. Seeing America up close made defeat easier to accept and recovery easier to imagine. The United States had not only beaten Germany militarily, it had revealed a different way a society could function, one characterized by abundance rather than austerity, rights rather than fear, and opportunity rather than rigid hierarchy. Thus, the effects of those wartime breakfasts extended far beyond the fences of the POW camps. They shaped private memories, informed public attitudes, and contributed quietly to the cultural foundation of a new Germany, one that hoped to rebuild not through dominance, but through stability, cooperation, and lessons learned from a world it once sought to conquer. And with these long-term consequences in view, the story moves toward its final reflection, A moment to step back and consider what this seemingly simple experience reveals about war, humanity, and the forces that shape nations. In the end, the story of German POWs stunned by the American breakfast table is not merely a tale of food. It is a window into the deeper forces that define war, forces far quieter than artillery and far more enduring than battlefield movements. What those prisoners encountered each morning was the material expression of a nation whose strength did not rely on conquest or ideology, but on capacity, organization, and confidence rooted in stability. The eggs, the bread, the endless coffee, the consistency of it all, these details revealed a truth that no speech or interrogation could convey. They showed that power in the modern world rests not only in weapons, but in the systems that support them. The farms, the factories, the transport networks, the policies, and the social trust that binds a nation together. America's abundance was not an accident of geography alone. It was the product of a society capable of mobilizing without breaking, expanding without collapsing, and supplying its soldiers and prisoners alike without losing its sense of order. For the German prisoners, this realization marked a quiet turning point. It softened the edges of animosity. It forced reconsideration of beliefs once held with certainty. And long after the war ended, the memory of those meals continued to echo. Not as symbols of defeat, but as reminders of how nations rise or falter based on the worlds they build behind the front lines. History often remembers the great battles, the sweeping offensives, the decisive moments where victory or defeat becomes unmistakable. But sometimes, understanding a war requires looking at something as ordinary as a breakfast served at dawn. Within that simplicity lies a profound truth. Wars are not won only by courage or strategy, but by the strength of the societies that stand behind the soldiers. And in those quiet American mess halls, thousands of miles from the front, that truth became impossible to ignore.